Hello and welcome to another OLLO Chat episode distributed by the Headliner Magazine UK. In this one, we have two experienced engineers in mixing hundreds of stems in a single song. We'll pick their brain on how they prepare their sessions, how they make decisions, and if they ever deleted a couple of stems just to make life easier. Joined here with us, Kevin McCombs and William Robertson. How are you guys doing?
Good. How are you doing this morning?
Fantastic. So, Kevin, you're in LA at the moment?
I am, yeah. I just got in from Nashville yesterday morning.
So you're just going back and forth between Nashville and LA a lot, I guess?
I am, yeah. Every 2 weeks or so, yeah.
So you're working for like two production houses. What's the reason for going back and forth?
So the producer that I work with every single day moved his family to Nashville last May. And so we just take projects in both locations. It depends. I just spent 10 weeks in Nashville and we're about to spend the entire summer here in LA. So it just depends on the record.
Wonderful. William, you're in London, I guess.
Yeah, still in London indeed. Yeah, living in a studio now, just upstairs actually of the studio. So yeah, I'm not moving until we fix these ATC amps, unfortunately. So yeah, apart from that, yeah, it's all good.
Yeah, watch your back with the heavy-duty machinery.
Yeah, it's just
dive into this one. It's about dance mixes, right? So not dance as the EDM, but dance as a lot of stuff happening in a mix in a song. So theoretically, we have a dummy head over here in our lab. We call him Frank. And Frank helps us out a lot when we do these kind of thought experiments and stuff like that. So let's assume Frank would start mixing records, right? At some point, he will get, a job for mixing 300 stems or more, maybe. So what are the two things that he should absolutely do, or maybe even check before he accepts the job offering? What are the two main things that you guys consider in these kind of situations? Maybe Kevin, you can start.
Sure. Typically, any song that we end up mixing with a track count that high is because we are the ones responsible for the production that size. So it's kind of already in our session where we're not just receiving 400 stems out of the blue from someone else. However, it's not inconceivable that we'll receive track counts that high. And yeah, before we receive it, we just have to make sure that, everything is labeled. If it's, audio 6 or whatever, it'll take several hours to just go through and identify what's even going on and, color code everything in the session, set it up to where, it looks like any other session, but just a larger version of that. And then, once everything is kind of in place, then you can really just apply the same philosophy as you would to any mix. We always start with the drums, move on to the low end vocal, and then the mid range. And after that process is repeated a few times, the mix can kind of be refined, and then you head into automation and transitions and that sort of thing. But largely it's the same.
William, do you also get responsible for the 300 stems, or do you get them in?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it's true that it's sometimes part of our own craft that it becomes to end up piling up like 300 tracks. It's true. But it happens also sometimes that I receive that much. Maybe 300, maybe the max I probably receive actually, never more than that for a normal music, not for a movie or stuff like that, just for normal, like streaming music, we can say. And I actually completely agree with the point here, because it's the same thing, because in the end, you will end up having buses that groups all these tracks together. So when you mix with these buses, in the end, it strips down the mix to a manageable amount of tracks. So in the end, it becomes almost being like a normal mix, we can say, with a normal amount of track that you would expect. The only thing is it gets complicated when you're on the production team. Of course, it gets complicated to have all these layers working well together, because it's a thing to bus a lot of stuff together and then mix it. But if you burst a lot of stuff that don't work together very well, in the end, it's going to be a big mess. It's almost like if you recorded something but badly, or not, or the recording doesn't fit the song, you end up fighting it. And it's the same here, except that you recorded 15 things badly in a way, and you're piling them up, and in the end you're like realizing that it's not good.
Would it make sense for our Frank to consider firstly maybe, okay, what are the labels, what are the actual stems, and then maybe before even start clicking away, kind of design the project in a mind map or something, like what goes together, how to approach it, how to break it down essentially. Is that a step that is like important? Will it save time? What do you think, William?
I think it's mandatory in that sense. Otherwise, you will end up scrolling down and realizing like, oh damn, 252 is muted. I wanted it, and it's a mess. And if you don't know where it's burst, well, if that 252 track doesn't have a color that makes sense to you, or a name, if it's just called Audio 1, it's a pain, really. So definitely labeling stuff properly and color coding stuff properly is mandatory. Like I cannot imagine doing it without it.
Do you, Kevin, by any chance have like a separate notebook or a Word file or Excel or whatever to kind of keep things organized, or do you just trust that you can put all the information you need, all the metadata for yourself inside the session?
It's really different for every session. So for the most part, I just have to go on a track by track or sort of track category kind of basis. I will say that the thing that we end up doing that makes it the most digestible from the start is finding multiple sources that just constitute one sound. So if it's rhythm guitars, if there's 3 microphones per side, and there's a left and right of one tone, a left and right of another tone, and a left and right of a third tone, really it's just one sound. So if I end up bussing those things together, even before it'll hit my sort of like higher order buses that are there in every single mix, then I can start to go ahead and like commit immediately and print things down. Because once I settle on a balance between, a 57 and a ribbon mic on a guitar cab, then I don't really ever want to think about that again. And ultimately, I will end up bouncing down, something that could be 12 microphones into one stereo track, and then, disable and hide them out of my session in case I need them for whatever reason later. But for the most part, being organized and then committing as soon as possible to the decisions that you make is the only way that you'll keep your head above water when you're dealing with track counts this high. In fact, we 2 weeks ago, I think we hit a new personal record for our mixes, including all of the demo production that had to be referenced for the mix that we were doing and everything involved. It ended up being 440 tracks, which
that is a lot.
Yeah, in the abstract is perhaps even too many.
But it begs the question, can you run that out of a laptop? There is so many things happening. If you're using plugins, and a ton of plugins probably, this thing can, run out of power quite quickly, I think.
That is very true. So for the same reason that I brought up, committing levels into stereo files, that will also commit any processing that you have on the individual mono tracks. So long as you have a good compass as you're working the entire time, and you trust the decisions that you're making, you're not working until 3-4 in the morning on something that you've been at all day. so long as you trust yourself and the decisions that you're making, you can commit to things, and that will reduce the load on the CPU. That being said, we run either a desktop or a laptop setup, but the computing power wise, they're almost identical. But the thing that we have that allows us to deal with track counts that high, especially when it comes to like vocal stacks, where you have to have a plug-in chain on each individual channel, is lots of universal audio stuff, which is effectively just a second set of computers just for plugins. So between those two things, committing to processing and having something external to your computer also crunching the numbers, I mean, you max out on CPU on every session, no matter what. Like even if you're not trying to do so, it will fill the shape of whatever container you give it.
Yeah. So William, we've talked about hybrid mixing like 2 years ago, I think. And you're probably doing that a lot still.
Yeah.
So in a case of like a real dense mix, when you have a lot of things, how do you make decisions? What are you gonna take out to the board and put it back? Do you do that kind of like early on into the project, knowing what's coming, or will it just leave it till the end and then maybe just do the final processing? What's your approach on that?
On what you mean when you say taking out. Do you mean muting tracks or committing to something?
Sending to analog and back, yeah.
Sending to analog and back. It's actually the same kind of mindset as Kevin has, is you commit to a bunch of processing and make a stereo track out of a bunch of tracks. It's the same kind of mindset, except instead of UAD plugins, it's hardware, but actually it works exactly in the same way. And it makes it easy also to manage. And also, it's hard to have that when you have a lot of track, but I like my session to be easy for the CPU, which is never the case when you got that much plugins. So I really feel relieved when I can play back the track with all these tracks stacked together and there is no hiccups. So I really struggle to get that right. And for that, I'm open to like print a lot of stuff. Actually, recently I did something that it's risky, but it's still not surgery, so it's not a big risk per se. But I decided to commit the whole drums to a pair of stereo track, and it's something that it's scary in a way, but it ended up working very well, because I used for instance, the artist, after I did that, I committed the drums to 1178 and stuff like that. And the artist asked, can we have a little bit more kick? I was like, damn. And actually the easiest way was just to bring back the original kick drum. And since I committed to the 1178 on the Avid HDX system, it was a line in terms of sample and phase, because if you don't have that, like if you have normal Pro Tools, it will be a bit late, a bit delay. And if you are not aligning track back in, if for instance, I brought back the kick drum according to the drum print, it would be a bit out of phase and would be very hard to manage. So that makes it easy also. And yeah, I just brought the original kick and just push it. And if I wanted less, that's where it gets tricky, because it gets sketchy in a way, but I just brought the original kick and flipped the phase and just put it a little bit in, and it actually works very well, except the only time it won't work is if they ask less room or less, that kind of thing, like you cannot go away with it. Because when you're flipping the phase of the kick drum, for instance, to reduce his volume, it's still going to be present in the room. It's just going to be a bit further away in a way. So yeah, it's not exactly like reducing the fader. So that's the kind of thing I do sometimes, but that's the most extreme I've done, like printing a whole drums, because I felt that I really liked what the compressor was doing. There were a lot of tracks. My computer was dying pretty much, was burning out. And all the rest, the vocals and stuff, were so precious to the artist, and he wasn't so precious about the drums, that I thought that's the only way really. And I could obviously not travel with an 1178 with me all the time. So that was the way also to record mixes that big everywhere, because it has been a struggle also with this kind of mixes. They are so heavy with the CPU that printing to analog helps you to actually free CPUs for the computer and be able to record the mixes everywhere, like wherever you can go, and be more flexible instead of struggling with recording outboard gear, because this is really not flexible and it's hard to maintain that workflow in 2022 actually. So that's how I...
Do you guys mix on your own? Do you have a producer there or a team helping you out with decisions, what to put together, how to commit? You just mentioned you need to commit to something in order to get to the end of this, right? So do you just take these decisions on your own, or is there somebody that you can talk to and maybe help you out a little bit so you don't get too much out of the line? Maybe Kevin, you can answer that.
Sure. I work with the producer Colin Britton every single day, and we're intimately involved in every single project. And in fact, we do a lot of co-mixing. So I'll sit down at a mix, between the hours of 10 at night and 4 in the morning, and then he'll come in the morning and do tweaks, and then we'll kind of go back and forth. But for the most part, we trust each other, but there is that system of checks and balances where, we have to agree on, the snare reverb and all of these things. But for the most part, we get along and we make decisions sort of hand in hand, where we're both interested in the same thing, which is that the mix, sounds awesome and modern, or whatever it needs to be based on the project that we're working on. But yeah, very much involved at every step of the process. And the thing that varies is how involved the artist is in, the mixing process. Some are a lot more heavy-handed. Others don't want to be a part of the process at all and just want to.
And what is like a better version for you guys? Is it better to have an artist there, or is it just a little too much noise? Let's say.
My preference is always to get an entire version out before we sort of deep dive with, hey, I remember this synth in layer 250 that I would love to be able to hear a little more. Yeah, absolutely, no problem. But the overall sort of scheme of how the mix comes together, artists in the room won't typically have the same vision of something if you press play on the stems before it is mixed. Our job is to sort of see the sculpture in the block of marble and then chisel away everything that doesn't look like a sculpture. And so I think it needs to sufficiently look and feel the way that it should before that kind of input is that valuable, because it needs to sound like the song without any obnoxious volume differences or like things aren't panned properly the way they should be, or transitions aren't, those are the kinds of things that bother artists and casual listeners more than anything. And at no point in the process does anyone need to hear it that way, basically, other than the mixer who's responsible for making it not be that way.
So, William, when you come down or mix down to these few buses, how does the session look like? When you really start mixing the final touches, when you have everything sorted out, all the buses are there, you've made the decision for this reverb and etc., and you really start placing the instruments, panning instruments, doing the final soundscape, right? How does the session look like? Is it still like 20 or more buses, or do you trim it down to 6, 5, 4? I don't know.
That's a good question, because it depends, of course, but most of the time it's still quite a lot of buses, of course. And also it's buses going to buses and going to the mix bus at the end. So it's a mountain and different scales of processing. And actually, I think when you got a lot of tracks, it's probably not the best, but the easiest way for me to approach mixing. Because when I first started mixing a lot of tracks, for instance, I pushed a lot of low end in one element of the bass, and suddenly the whole track was weak in terms of low end, but it was still hitting the limiter very loudly because of the lot of bass that element alone had. And that was a problem. So that's why having a lot of buses, and processing through these buses by little DAWs or by different DAWs that you put on is actually, I think, the easiest way. So that's why there could be 20 buses. I've never actually counted the buses, but there could be 20 buses also. And they could go, for instance, to music bus and vocal bus, or sometimes drums and bass bus if it's necessary for a certain style of music, or even sometimes vocal and background vocals separated and not together on the vocal bus, all that kind of stuff. But usually it's buses for the main parts, like for instance, you got guitar rhythm, that all the guitars that do the rhythm, then you got guitar ads, they're called ads, which are guitar production stuff, we can say, like noise in a way, stuff that adds up but are not a part of themselves, like something that you can hear but you feel most of the time. After you got different layers of bass, sometimes so real bass, you got the sub bass, you got drums, percussion, you got synths, you got SFX like transition, whoosh, and all that stuff. You got lead vocal most of the time. I group them together, even the lead, the chorus and the verse. Background vocals, sometimes what could be ad-libs, that makes 11. You can have also other layers of synths, which are not synths but keyboards, like Rhodes, pianos. It's different than synths. It needs to be treated differently. Acoustic guitar sometimes also are independent of the guitar rhythm, so that's 13.
Too many stems, crashed Google.
Yeah, our busing structure is actually almost identical to what he described. It just is a wide net that will catch any kind of production, where if you have those buses set up in your template, or whether or not you tailor them to the song that you're working on, you just need to have a place for everything to go that makes sense, where you just have to think of it in terms of categories, because if all of these things were just going to the stereo bus, it would be an absolute nightmare to say, hey, the drums need to come down, and then you need to grab 50 faders at the same time and then scoot them and jog. The processing on every bus is also largely a part of what's going to allow you to work with that many tracks, because you don't necessarily want to have separate compression settings on all of the things in the the piano and Rhodes bus or anything like that. It's helpful to have sort of a more global processing that fits together this category and this frequency range, and you can start to think of things condensed down to those sort of like 20 sub buses, and EQ moves made to the buses can end up towards the end of the process mattering a lot more than what you do on an individual track basis, for sure.
So what caught my attention a little bit was, or there was a thought, how about when you're mixing for Dolby or maybe some kind of surround version, and you have that 300 stems, right? So is there a difference? Can you maybe describe how you would approach a Dolby Atmos mix when you have that amount of stems? Is it a different approach, or do you just go the same roof? Since you do have to position objects around, that's kind of tricky,
right,
maybe a little bit.
So I will admit I have not done a whole lot of Atmos mixing, but I don't know that my philosophy about it would be any different, because just in the abstract, the Dolby Atmos environment is a panning plugin. It just allows you to take tracks, or in this case, objects, and sort of scoot them around in, you know, a version of three-dimensional space as we perceive it. And I don't know. Obviously, it's another layer of processing that we don't have access to in a stereo mix. But the process, in my mind, should be the same. It just determines, you know, hey, is this, you know, vocal reverb throw or anything like that? It would make sense to put this in a spatial place. Whereas, you know, I'm not so sure how useful it would be to have the bass guitar flying around. So largely, mixing these things still should come out sounding like music. And then, you know, just allows you to be creative in the Atmos space for things that make sense to do in that realm. I've heard a few Atmos mixes that that we've gotten back that are very cinematic in terms of how things are happening in space, and it's possible to lose what the song is about because there's too many you know, tricks going on. So for the most part, and it depends. Some music is made with Atmos in mind, and I think that's a very different process than taking what was once a stereo mix and sort of upmixing it to Atmos.
That's extremely important. Just the approach, or maybe it's just the decision and the beginning of the production. Is this going to be just a stereo mix or stereo song, or are we pursuing the Atmos version of it and maybe making a decision with the artist and the producer? Are these two versions going to be similar, or are we just, you know, letting the platform push the mix in whatever way?
Right.
William, thank you for joining us again. You dropped out there for a second.
Yeah, no problem. I changed the browser to another one, and weirdly, I think the camera is darker now. I don't know why.
It's fine. We're coming to an end anyway. So maybe, William, can you share your approach on Dolby Atmos? Would you approach it differently in the light of having 300 stems, then having another 15, 20 buses, and then, you know, a request to put that into Dolby Atmos? How would you approach it?
Actually, it's an interesting question again, because recently I've been to a Dolby Atmos room because we have no access to a Dolby Atmos room, and I finally understood the struggle that you can have when there is a lot of buses implied, actually. Because, for instance, you got one track going to one buses and another one, like a guitar going to guitar bus going to instrument bus going to mix bus, for example. It's a very rough example. Every processing that you will do, if you do not print it for the final stems of the Dolby, it will sound totally different in the end. And that's a big problem that realized the guys at the Dolby Atmos room had, and I will probably have, because I will probably end up mixing in that room, so I'll probably have the same problem, is making sure that when you print the stems, the processing is printed in, which takes a lot more time or require a more strict workflow in a way, with the VCAs in Pro Tools, for instance, instead of the auxes and stuff like that. But that's the main struggle, in my opinion, is the processing in buses to make sure that it's respected, especially when you have mixed bus processing implied. Because on Dolby Atmos, the mixed bus processing is much different, if non-existent, most of the time, because of the formats. Because in the Dolby Atmos, I don't know if you know how it works exactly, but you got objects, you got the 7.1, and you got objects. Objects are I think you have, I can't remember, like a high number of objects. We can move like this, and that's what the objects are most of the time. Otherwise, you got your bed, which is the 7.1 and stuff like that. And the objects are not going to the mix bus per se in Pro Tools. So when you put processing on, the mix bus is not applied to the object. So in the end, on the mix bus, you end up having a limiter, and that's it, to make sure that it's not clipping. because of the loudness restriction is a bit different also for Dolby. So the main problem with Dolby, I would say, is the bus processing, making sure that when you print the stems and you put them back in your session, even not even a Dolby session yet, but just a normal session, it sounds at least very similar to the final mix, the final stereo mix. Otherwise, it's going to be a cat and mouse game, fighting the plugin to print and the one to put back, and again, the computer is the one that loses in that game again. So yeah, that's my thing.
Thank you. Guys, we are running out a little bit of time, so thank you very, very much for sharing this kind of unique experience. There's not many mix guys that actually do this kind of things with so many stems. So thank you very much for sharing that with OLLO and our community. So this episode is distributed by the Headliner Magazine UK, which is also present in the USA. So both of you guys, you can check it out once it's released next week. And of course, to all our listeners, you're more than welcome to join Headliner Magazine Radio, or just find us on Spotify, on YouTube, etc., and enjoy debates like this one about mixing, about Dolby Atmos many times, about headphones, of course. We are a headphone manufacturer. We didn't talk about headphones today anyway, but you both do wear our headphones. Wow. So how do they do?
Yeah. Is it for? Are you talking for Dolby? Because that's a different subject. Headphones for Dolby. It's a very spicy subject, actually. Subject to a lot of debate.
Yeah, that's a good term for it. Anyone with a room with speakers will tell you it's a bad idea. Anyone who does it on headphones says the room's a bad idea. So
yeah, that kind of sums it up. It's I don't know. It's a funny thing in maybe it's in other industries as well, but in audio there's always a debate about something versus something. It's always about analog versus digital. It's always about headphones versus whatever. It's always a bass versus guitar. It's always something. So I don't know if you experience that, but at least from my side, the audio industry kind of looks like we're going to have a fight any moment now.
Yeah, it seems to be very heated in that sense. I don't know if it's only the audio industry, or it's maybe a wider actually issues, if we can say it's an issue. There's the way to divide and stuff like that. But in audio, we always liked also to compare, actually. That's why you end up having teams, because you end up comparing, and it's also so subjective that if something like make you feel some specific emotion, you get attached to that thing for whatever reason, may it be a headphones, room, or even a compressor sometimes. And you think that's the best thing of the world. Like, it really resonated in me. And the other guy is like, that's crap. And you almost, you're like, you can, it's almost like he's saying, or she's saying, your feelings are crap. And that's why it creates that kind of division and that kind of clans, whereas everything should work in concert and together instead of like a fight. But I think that's one of the explanation I could see of why it's always this versus this. And also because it's good for clicks and views, because it's more straightforward. That's also a thing.
Well, as long as we stay respectful to each other and support the industry going forward, I think we'll be fine. Kevin, William, thank you very, very much for this one. And I hope to do that another time.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah,
stay safe. Cheers.
Cheers.